The first time I ever kissed him, it wasn't romantic. It wasn't even intentional. I didn't know what it meant when I walked into his room that night, two friends, laughing, arguing, the usual. But then I noticed something different in his eyes. They were darker than usual, pulling me in with a look I hadn't seen before. I hadn't known it then, but that moment would change everything between us, though not in the way I thought. We were sitting close, our bodies touching as we talked about our future, about what we wanted to do when everything in life felt uncertain. We'd been friends for years, and it was always supposed to be just that, friendship. Nothing more, nothing less. That night, however, something hung in the air between us, a tension that felt too thick to ignore. It wasn't love. It wasn't desire. At least, that's what I told myself. Suddenly, he looked at me like I was something else, something more, something vulnerable. And before I could pull away, his lips brushed against mine. It wasn't soft like I expected, nor was it filled with the electricity of a first kiss. It was desperate, confused. It was a collision of two people who didn't know what they wanted but knew they couldn't walk away from what was happening. The world outside his bedroom ceased to exist. I could hear my heart pounding, could feel my hands trembling against my lap. His kiss was brief, but it stayed with me long after, lingering like a question we couldn't answer. He pulled away first, looking just as stunned as I was, and the awkward silence that followed nearly suffocated me. We both stood up quickly, as if that one moment of unexpected vulnerability had been too much to bear. I was angry not at him but at myself. How could I let this happen? How could I allow something so deeply confusing to exist between us? We had always been friends, I had always been sure about that, I never questioned it. But in that instant I found myself questioning everything, my feelings, my body, my heart, and even him. I thought I could laugh it off, brush it under the rug, pretend it was nothing. But I couldn't, because every time I saw him after that, something had shifted. There was a space between us that wasn't there before, a space filled with possibility but also fear. What if he saw something in me I couldn't recognize? What if I was more than just a friend to him too? What if everything I thought I knew about myself was wrong? And so, it was supposed to end there. That night was supposed to be a fluke, a one-time incident that would disappear into the depths of forgotten memories. But instead, it stayed with me, like a nagging thought that wouldn't leave, like a fire that refused to be extinguished. What I didn't realize was that it wasn't the kiss that changed everything. It was the way it made me feel, the way it made him feel. The weeks after that night felt like a constant game of pretending. He was still my best friend and I still thought of him that way. At least, I told myself I did. But something inside me kept shifting, pulling me into a direction I wasn't ready to go. Every conversation we had felt laced with unspoken words. Every glance between us weighted with more than just friendship. We went to the same coffee shop every Saturday morning, just like we always did. We'd sit at the same corner table, talking about the dumbest things, films we wanted to watch, places we wanted to travel, and all the things that meant nothing and everything at once. But that Saturday was different. It started when he looked at me a little too long, his eyes catching mine across the table, lingering there like he was waiting for something. My heart skipped. A nervous laugh slipped from my lips, but he didn't smile. He just kept looking at me like he was trying to read me, figure me out in ways I wasn't sure I wanted him to. Then, without warning, he reached out across the table and took my hand. It wasn't a casual touch. It wasn't a friendly squeeze. It was firm, purposeful, like he had been waiting to do it for a long time. The room seemed to close in on us. the clatter of dishes and murmurs of conversation fading into the background as everything shifted around us. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to pull away, to pretend this wasn't happening, but something inside me wanted this, wanted him, in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. "Are we okay?" he asked, his voice quiet, vulnerable, like he was testing the waters. His thumb brushed gently against my skin, sending a shiver up my spine. After what happened that night, I've been thinking a lot about it." His words hung in the air, so fragile, so uncertain. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I had no idea what I wanted. I thought I did. I thought I knew who I was, who he was, and what our relationship meant. But the truth was, I didn't know anything. I wasn't sure if I was terrified of losing him as a friend, or if I was terrified of losing myself if I admitted that I wanted more. He was staring at me now, searching my face for a sign that I felt the same way. And I realized that the longer I stayed silent, the more that silence was going to speak louder than any words I could say. "I don't know what's happening," I finally whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. The honesty in those words felt like a weight lifted from my chest, but it was also the heaviest burden I had ever carried. We weren't just friends anymore. We couldn't be. Something had changed, and neither of us had the courage to face it. I wanted to tell him the truth, but how could I? How could I admit that I had fallen in love with him when I didn't even understand what that meant? He squeezed my hand, and for a moment, I felt like I was drowning in the truth of it all. This wasn't just a casual friendship anymore. This wasn't just a phase. This was real, and I had no idea how to navigate the chaos I had just opened. The days that followed felt like I was living in two different worlds. On the outside, we went about our usual routines, laughing, joking, sharing the same inside jokes that had always been the backbone of our friendship. But beneath it all, I could feel the tension growing, the invisible line between us tightening with every word, every touch, every lingering look. We were both pretending to be okay, but neither of us was fooling anyone, not even ourselves. The unspoken words had become a barrier between us, and every time we interacted, I felt myself being pulled in two directions. On one hand, I wanted to confess everything, to tell him that I couldn't stop thinking about him, that my feelings had changed, that I was terrified of what would happen if I admitted it. But on the other hand, I was terrified of losing him. The thought of ruining everything we had, of turning our deep friendship into something messy and complicated, felt like a risk too big to take. It all came to a head one night when we were out at a small party, the kind we used to attend together just for the sake of having fun. But this time, everything felt different. The music was louder, the crowd was more overwhelming, and in the midst of it, I felt more alone than I ever had. I glanced around, searching for something familiar, and there he was, standing at the edge of the room, his eyes already on me. Without thinking, I made my way toward him, the noise fading into the background. We stood there for a long time, not speaking, just feeling the pull of something more than what we had. I could see it in his eyes, the same uncertainty, the same hunger. And then, just like that, he leaned in. His lips found mine again, but this time it wasn't quick. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a mistake. This time it was real, it was deep, and it changed everything. The kiss wasn't desperate or confused. It was filled with something neither of us had ever allowed ourselves to acknowledge before. The moment I felt him kiss me, I knew I wasn't just holding on to a friendship anymore. I wasn't holding on to the version of him I had known for years. I was holding on to the future. I was holding on to the unknown. But the terrifying part was, I didn't know if we could survive what we were becoming. He pulled away first, his eyes searching mine for some kind of confirmation. But what could I say? Could I tell him that I was falling in love with him, that I had been for longer than I could admit? Could I admit that this wasn't just a phase or a fleeting feeling? We stood there, our foreheads touching, both of us trying to understand what had just happened. And then he whispered something that shattered everything I thought I knew. "I've loved you for so long, but I didn't think you'd ever feel the same," he said, his voice breaking in a way I had never heard before. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. How could I have missed it? How could I have not known? All this time, all these years of friendship, I had thought I was the only one hiding something, that I was the only one confused. But in that moment, I realized that he had been just as lost as I had. And I realized something else, that I had been living my whole life thinking I was just his friend. But in that moment, it all clicked into place. I had always been more to him. And the real twist was, I had always been more to myself than I had ever allowed myself to see. The next few days were a blur of emotions, confusion, exhilaration, fear, and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. We hadn't talked about what had happened, not directly anyway. It hung in the air between us, thick with unspoken truths, a tension neither of us dared to acknowledge fully. Every time I saw him, I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, balancing between the person I had always been with him and the person I was becoming. We tried to act like nothing had changed, like the kiss hadn't happened, but the truth was, it had changed everything. I could feel the cracks forming in the foundation of our friendship, the delicate threads of everything we'd built together unraveling as we both tried to figure out what the next step was. And then, one night, he called me. It was late, past midnight, and I could hear the shakiness in his voice when I picked up. "Can we talk?" he asked, his words laced with something that made my stomach drop. It wasn't the usual tone we used when we called each other late at night. It was serious, almost desperate. I immediately felt a rush of panic. What did he want to say? Was he going to take it all back? Was he regretting the kiss, regretting us, regretting everything? My mind spiraled as I grabbed my coat and headed out to meet him, the cold night air biting at my skin, but somehow I didn't feel it. It felt like everything had numbed, like nothing mattered except the conversation we were about to have. When I got to his place, he was sitting on the front steps, waiting for me, his face shadowed in the dim light. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us was deafening. I stood there, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to move forward. Finally, he stood and walked over to me. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice tight. "After everything, after the kiss, after all this time, there's no going back. There's no pretending anymore." He paused, taking a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to say the words that had been weighing on him. "I love you. I've always loved you, and I can't keep hiding it anymore." The world around me seemed to stop. My heart was racing, my hands shaking, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts I couldn't process fast enough. How could this be real? How could he, my best friend, the person who had always been there, be telling me this? Was I ready to hear it? Was I ready to face the truth of what this meant for both of us? He took a step closer, his eyes filled with both fear and hope. "I know this changes everything. I know this is scary as hell, but I can't live in the shadow of what we've been anymore. I need to know if you feel the same way. Do you?" His question hung in the air like a fragile, precious thing, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind was screaming. My heart was pounding in my chest, but all I could do was look at him. Look at the person who had always been there, who had always been my rock, and finally admit the truth. "I do," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips, but in that moment they felt like the most important thing I'd ever said. "I've always loved you too." And in that instant, something shifted between us. The fear, the uncertainty, the anxiety of what might come next, it all melted away. We weren't just two people lost in the confusion of what could have been. We were two people, finally acknowledging what had been there all along. And it wasn't just a kiss or a momentary feeling. It was real. The days after that conversation felt like a rebirth, but it wasn't without its struggles. We were no longer just friends, but the idea of being more than that came with complexities we hadn't expected. Our connection, once so simple, now felt like it was wrapped in layers of new emotions. Love, yes, but also fear, doubt, and confusion. We spent hours talking, unraveling the threads of everything that had led us to this point, trying to piece together how we could move forward. There were moments of laughter, moments of silence, moments where the weight of our new reality settled heavily between us. We had crossed a line and there was no going back, but that wasn't what scared me the most. It was the realization that love, real love, wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be some flawless dream come true. We had to learn how to navigate this new version of us, one where friendship and romance intertwined, where everything we thought we knew had to be rewritten. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were days when I woke up beside him, my heart filled with joy and fear all at once. I would reach over to touch his face to reassure myself that this was real, that this wasn't some beautiful, fragile dream I would wake up from. But there were also days when doubts crept in. When I would stare at him, my best friend, the person who had always been my constant, and wonder if we could really be what we now claim to be. What if we lost everything we had? What if our love wasn't enough to hold us together? The truth was, there was no guarantee of anything. Love was messy, unpredictable, and didn't come with a blueprint. But in the moments where I saw him smile, when I held his hand and felt the warmth of his touch, I knew we were worth fighting for. Then came the moment when everything truly clicked into place. We were sitting by the water one afternoon, just the two of us, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange as the sun began to set. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw the full scope of what we had built, not just as friends, but as something more. Our past, our present, our shared memories, they were the foundation of this love, but it wasn't just that. It was us, two people who had dared to step beyond the safety of their old selves and embrace something new, something terrifyingly beautiful. "Are you scared?" I asked him, my voice soft against the hum of the evening. He turned to me, his eyes reflecting the same uncertainty, but also a quiet assurance that made my heart swell. "I'm terrified," he admitted, his hand finding mine, a gentle squeeze that spoke volumes. "But I think that's the point, right? We're both scared, but we're still here. We're still trying, and that's all that matters." His words resonated with me in a way nothing else ever had. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know what the future held. But we had each other, and for the first time that felt like enough. The truth I had been denying for so long, the truth I hadn't wanted to face, was that I had never truly been just his friend. From the very beginning, I had been falling in love with him, piece by piece, even when I didn't understand it. And now, as we stood on the brink of something neither of us could fully define, I realized that love wasn't just about understanding. It was about embracing the unknown, taking the leap, and trusting that no matter what happened, we would land together. The journey wasn't going to be easy, but it was ours. And that made all the difference.